good place for Katie to be through all this, but could I ask to be brought to a different hospital? I kept feeling like we should be panicking or worried or something, but then I would look at Katie and see the peace that she had, a peace that could only come from God, and then I too would feel his presence in that room. At one point, when I didn't know what to say or do, I simply started humming Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing to fill the silence. Katie interrupted and told me it was one of her favorite hymns. Later, when the doctors were talking about Katie in the hallway and I didn't want her to overhear what they were saying and get scared, I started to sing Come Thou Fount aloud. Katie was the first and possibly only student that I would ever sing to. Eventually, we were told we would be transferred to a nearby children's hospital. Katie reminded me that I had promised to ride in the back of the ambulance with her, rather than in the front like the last time. I didn't have much to give, but Katie was simply asking for my presence. When the paramedics tried leading me to the front passenger seat, I told them I was small and I would fit in the back somehow. Katie was being so brave. It seemed like the least I could do was to be a little bit bossy. When we arrived at the Jackson Memorial Hospital, the questions started all over again. And Katie and I had to tell the story at least a dozen more times. Our time at the hospital went something like this. 10 p.m. We were introduced to more doctors. There were a lot more questions, and she had an MRI. 11 p.m. The doctors decided Katie should have another, longer MRI, and was almost totally numb and starting to feel nauseous. Katie was worried, and rightly so, that if she threw up while she was in the MRI, she wouldn't be able to roll over to her side. The doctors said they would give her a button to push if anything went wrong. We had to remind them that she couldn't move her hands either. The next best option, they said, was to yell really loudly over the noise of the machine, which was really loud. That didn't sit so well with Katie, but there was no other option, so we prayed together and let them wheel her into the room. Midnight. Thankfully, Katie fell asleep during the MRI, which was good because they decided to do some extra scans, and the entire thing took over 2 hours. I wandered through the hospital to find cell phone reception to call Katie's parents, Mrs. Roozeboom, to tell her we wouldn't be coming the next day, and my own family to ask for their prayers. I also asked the doctor if he would please call her parents so they could tell them what was going on in front of call her parents so that they could tell them what was going on. I didn't feel comfortable being the only one talking with them and didn't know if I should be the person to tell them they needed to fly out to Miami. I also spent a good chunk of time on my knees in the deserted waiting room, praying for Katie, praying for the doctors, and thanking God that all this had happened in a big city like Miami, where there was a hospital with so many specialists. 2 o'clock a.m. The MRI was over, and they transferred us to the PICU. We met more doctors and answered more questions. They needed one more test, a spinal tap, because tests on the fluid from Katie's spine were needed to determine if indeed she had Guillain-Barré, as they were suspecting at that time. When Katie heard she needed one more test, she broke down for the first time, saying she wanted her mom and dad. I tried to be strong, but as I held her body, which was now motionless from her shoulders down, I struggled to fight back my own tears, while praying aloud that God would give Katie just a little more strength to make it through one more test. I told her I would come back as soon as they let me in, and I headed out into the hallway to wait. I will never forget Dr. Zen, who was out in the hallway and walked toward me with open arms to give me a big hug. I totally broke down and started sobbing. I think if we are truly going to care for other people, we can't do it alone. Throughout the remainder of my stay, I came to appreciate the doctors and nurses who were so supportive and caring. Not just what they did for Katie and me, but the way they did it made such a huge difference. 4 a.m. I was ushered back into the room where I was allowed to spend the night with Katie. I was so thankful that we had a room where I was able to stay. I couldn't imagine leaving Katie for the rest of the night. I maneuvered the chair that folded down into a bed through all the machines in Katie's room so that I could still see her face from where I lay in bed. We slept some, but it was hard with the continual beeping of all the machines and the nurses coming in and out. The next day, beginning at 7 in the morning, specialists began to arrive to meet with Katie in hopes of getting a better understanding of what was going on. The long line of doctors who needed to see Katie was difficult because of how they each needed to poke at her and try to move her legs around and ask more questions. But so were the times when it was just the two of us and the morning seemed to stretch on and on. The day offered many opportunities to care for Katie. I sang every verse to every hymn that I could think of during the time when it was just the two of us. Later, I even started to sing when the nurses and doctors were in the room, and Katie When Katie grew tired and sick of speaking, I repeated the story of what happened to all the doctors who needed to know. At times, my care for Katie simply took the form of holding apple juice for her to drink, stroking her head while the nurses drew blood, or placing her favorite blanket around her face so that she could rest her cheek on it. Late in the morning, Mr. Vree called saying he was catching a flight out of Chicago. I had switched my own flight to the evening, but if Mr. Vree's flight was even a little late, there was no way there would still be time to make it to the airport after he arrived. I had already switched my ticket twice and wasn't allowed to change it again. I could tell that Katie was anxious, worried that I would leave the hospital before her dad arrived. I promised her I wouldn't, but I think she still was concerned that I might. I tried my best to assure her that even though I had barely known her 24 hours ago, there was no way I would leave her alone now, even if it meant giving up a trip to Guatemala. As the morning turned to afternoon, Katie's breathing continued to get weaker. The doctors were concerned that the paralysis would spread to her lungs next. They told me it was the natural progression. They monitored her breathing with a test every hour. I cheered her on as she blew into the machine, and I prayed fervently that God would keep Katie's lungs strong at least until her dad arrived. Katie had been going in and out of a restless sleep all morning and was cognizant at times, but out of it at others. If her breathing got worse, they would have to put her on a ventilator. I desperately wanted her to still be able to talk to her dad when he arrived. God answered those prayers. I received a call from a couple from a local Miami church. I honestly cannot remember their names, but they were old friends of the Vrees and an uncle and aunt of Katie Voss. They would be picking Mr. Vree up from the airport and bringing him to the hospital, then taking me from the hospital to the airport to catch my own flight. They shared how the whole church was praying for Katie and willing to help in any way necessary. When they arrived at the hospital with Mr. Vree, I led him to the room that Katie was in and left them some time to be alone together. Exiting the room, I was embraced by the couple from Miami. I shared with them more of the details and felt a weight lifted from my shoulders as they promised to be there for Katie now that I had to leave. They cared for me as I had cared for Katie. I know that in the weeks that followed before the Vrees were able to return to Chicago, this church community filled a very important role, caring both physically and spiritually for the needs of the Vree family. I had tears in my eyes as I said goodbye to Katie before leaving to catch my flight. In such a short time, I had developed such a deep connection with her. I feel privileged that God called me to this, as it has forever shaped who I am. I will never forget the courage and faith of Katie and her parents as they began down this difficult road that God had called them to travel. Before the trip ever began, they prayed, "God, your will be done." I think many of us pray this, but how many of us truly mean it? If you knew God was calling you to walk a path like the one the Vrees are on, would you still pray, "Your will be done"? Are you willing to hand your life over to God that completely and then walk in faith down whatever road He calls you? God had offered me an opportunity to care for such an amazing girl in such a unique situation when no one else could be there. The circumstances had been uncomfortable and scary, but I knew that God was calling me to step up and be there for Katie when she needed someone the most. He had given me the courage to care for Katie and kept me strong even as things grew worse. Often my words and actions seemed very inadequate for the situation. However, in many ways, what Katie needed most as we waited for her dad to arrive was someone to be by her side. My presence, which was something I could give, is what she needed most. God called me to care for Katie during the first 24 hours when everything began. Since then, there have been so many people caring for Katie through prayer, support, visiting her, providing financially, and in so many other ways. We are going to hear a little bit from these girls who are friends of Katie's about how God has called them to show care for Katie through these times.
I miss Katie a lot, obviously. It was hard at first only getting to see her once a week. But now that her finger strength has gotten a lot better, we can communicate a lot more now through texting and phone calls. Now that the school year has started, I do not want Katie to be lonely. So my mom and I take a van full of kids up to see her every Friday. I miss going to the barn with her and hopping on my horse and her hopping on my horse with me. I miss having bonfires at her house and watching her completely fail trying to park her dad's truck at a pump at the gas station, and the list goes on. A lot of people have asked me if our friendship is different now that she's in a wheelchair and we can't do normal things anymore. The answer
since Katie was hospitalized. For starters, whenever I wanted to make plans to do something with my friends, I would always ask her first. But now she isn't even able to do everything we want to do. So instead of just forgetting about her, we go visit her. That way we can all be together and still include her. Our small group, which is part of my youth group at my church, has been awesome about caring for her too, and trying to include her in most of what we do. We have a girls' Bible study, which used to meet at our leader's house, but now we're going to have it in Katie's room at RIC. I love this idea, even though it isn't convenient for me at all. I would much rather have a 2-hour Bible study and drive 15 minutes to get there than have 2 hours of extra travel plus the Bible study. But sometimes we have to go out of our way in order to care for others. Now I can honestly say that I look at my life differently. I try to make the most out of everything because you never know what will happen. You never think something like this will happen to you. I know I didn't, but God had other plans. So the challenge is to love and care for the people while you still have them right here.
God has given us a unique opportunity to be his hands and feet while we're together here. And we've mentioned as we've investigated the topic of care, serve, and know, just how we should become more aware of the various needs for those around us. Those that are apparent and obvious are more easily tended to, but diving deeper into those relationships and mending walls of relationships at times may be necessary. You may be called to do that. Katie's story is unique. We rally around her, and yet care takes many different forms. And one of the forms that we have opportunity to do is to be continually sacrifice our time, not just when a crisis occurs, but throughout the entire year, throughout our entire lives as we are the community